there is a stigma around STIs. Even with perfect hygiene, people are still getting UTIs. Especially Black women have been subjected. They've been used, they've been studied, they've been cut open and experimented on without consent. Period pain is normal, but period pain that interferes with your daily life is not. What if the reason you haven't gotten answers isn't because your body is broken, but because the system was never built to listen to you? Welcome to G Chats. Hi guys, welcome back to G Chats with your host, Gianna Jara, here in the G Spot. Today's episode, first of all, I'm matching my office setup with the brown hair, the white pants, the pink shirt. Like, I'm going with the theme of G Chats today. But in today's episode, it's going to be a really casual conversation about BV. And I know some of you are probably like, dang, Gianna, like that's not something new or something like revolutionary. My team and I were talking, we just feel like every few months, it should be a good idea to just discuss BV in case someone's new here or if people just want like new information. And I feel like a year ago or over a year ago at this point, when I first launched the podcast, I think I did an entire like BV episode. And I think throughout the first season and now the second season, I've talked about BV, but we haven't had like a BV focused episode in a really long time. So I kind of wanted to do this, and I feel like it makes the most sense because BV is always a topic of discussion because I think it's one of those things that affects so many different people from so many different backgrounds and very different ages. And it's just a widespread thing that I think a lot of people just don't talk about because it feels embarrassing to discuss. And I just wanted to talk about it because last year in March, there was actually a scientific journal that released a study that was done where essentially it allowed for a blanket statement to be said that bacterial vaginosis is an STI that men give to women. And I personally stand 10 toes down on the fact that that is such a harmful misinformation statement to say. Like, it is very much misinformation. I think it's very negligent of any medical professional to just like say, because BV is not an STI. So I think I just want to, without having my iPad and my thoughts down, again, I just wanted to have a very casual conversation about this and just share my thoughts. Like, as a biomedical engineer who studies female reproductive health, like, let me just walk you through like my thought process and how I think of bacterial vaginosis. What we do know is we have to lay down the foundation of what is BV? And before we dive into what BV is, you have to understand what BV is not. Your vagina, when it's healthy, is balanced. The vagina has millions of different bacteria living inside of it. And this is called a microbiome. This is an ecosystem. And so there's many different species inside of this ecosystem, just like nature ecosystems. Your microbiomes are ecosystems with different species living inside of it, different temperatures. Every part of your body has a microbiome, and microbiomes have different temperatures and different compounds that are thriving in it, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to the vaginal microbiome in this specific ecosystem, what we know is that lactobacillus bacteria is who is in charge. Lactobacillus bacteria is your good guys. And I like to tell people, like, think of lactobacillus as your military. So essentially what that means is they are surveillancing the environment 24/7. And they do this through a number of different ways. So number one, there's competitive adhesion. What you want is lactobacillus to occupy the epithelial space. You want lactobacillus to attach to the epithelial cells in the vagina, in the vaginal canal, and take up that space. If lactobacillus isn't taking up that space and isn't competing for adhesion, you can allow harmful bacteria or potentially harmful bacteria to take hold. So you want lactobacillus to compete for adhesion, which it does. This bacteria does compete for adhesion. Once it competes for adhesion and actually does adhere to the vaginal walls, it begins to use glycogen on the surface of the epithelial tissue. And glycogen is polysaccharide that's produced inside of the vagina. And a lot of times glycogen is connected to estrogen. So this is why we see a lot of people have a depletion of glycogen when they get to the point of menopause, because as you get older, you lose estrogen. So you can then lose glycogen. Now, glycogen, again, really important because it supplies lactobacillus energy so that lactobacillus can thrive and do its thing. When lactobacillus adheres and it's using glycogen and glycogen's byproducts and things like that, it then produces lactic acid, hydrogen peroxide, and some other antimicrobial compounds that helps support the vaginal environment. So lactic acid is mainly responsible for pH. And the reason I put pH in quotations if you're watching with my fingers is because I feel like everybody is always on the topic of pH balance, pH imbalance, without understanding that pH is simply a number. And pH means nothing if you're not understanding the environment. So yes, the vagina needs to be between a 3.8 and a 4.5. But the reason it's sitting in that environment is because of good bacteria. The good bacteria adhering to the vaginal walls and using the glycogen up to then produce byproducts is what's balancing your vaginal pH. When you have lactobacillus dominance, meaning there's more lactobacillus than any other species, which is what you want. Remember, key phrasing here, more lactobacillus than any other species. I'm not saying you only want lactobacillus because that's not possible. This is an ecosystem. This is an environment. You're not going to have just lactobacillus, but what you want is more lactobacillus than other things because in an ecosystem, there's good guys and there's bad guys, and there's some that are just normal. They're chill guys that don't do anything unless they're given the opportunity to. So with that, all that being said, you now should understand that like the vaginal microbiome should have this lactobacillus dominance, and the byproducts of lactobacillus dominating the environment is what allows for an acidic pH, allows for the vaginal tissue to be moisturized, bouncy, elastic, have all of the good qualities that a healthy vaginal microbiome should have. The issue is that there are a number of things that can make us lose good bacteria. And I think a lot of people don't realize this because a lot of people think like, what did people do back in the day? What did people do in the 1700s? Well, some people, if not a lot of people, had vaginal microbiome imbalances, but we didn't have the science or understanding or knowledge that we do now. Science is allowed to evolve. And what we've learned is that, yes, lactobacillus bacteria is resilient. That is absolutely true. But there are instances where lactobacillus can be depleted. And this isn't for everyone, but it's for some people. Some people are more sensitive than others. For some people, they have autoimmune diseases, which makes their immune system kind of be a little off. So it's harder to keep lactobacillus in their vaginal microbiome than others. For some people, it's antibiotics for an ear infection or antibiotics for strep throat. Antibiotics are broad spectrum, meaning that they can essentially kill off a multitude of different bacteria, not just the bacteria that you're trying to kill, like for the infection. So if you have strep throat, that is a throat infection due to streptococcus and an overgrowth of streptococcus. So when you are prescribed antibiotics for strep throat, the goal is to kill off the overgrowth of the streptococcus. However, those medications are typically broad spectrum and can also kill off the good bacteria in the vaginal microbiome, and that can allow for a yeast infection to happen, which is why so many women experience yeast infections after taking antibiotics for a totally unrelated infection. Like there's so many women who are like, I had surgery and got put on antibiotics to prevent an infection, and now I have a yeast infection. That happens because antibiotics are broad spectrum. For some people, it's stress. For other people, it's hormonal related conditions. PMOS, which PMOS used to be called PCOS. It just got renamed. It's so many different things. For some people, the things involved in sex can make them lose good bacteria. So for example, seminal fluid is one of them. Seminal fluid is alkaline, and if you are repeatedly exposing the vaginal microbiome to seminal fluid, over time, this can chronically put the vagina in a state of alkaline pH activity, which can suppress lactobacillus activity and can make lactobacillus die off. It's obviously important to have conversations with a male partner if they're ejaculating inside of you all the time. If you're on birth control and you're like, oh, they can ejaculate inside of me all the time, it's important to understand that seminal fluid can impact lactobacillus activity and make you lose this good bacteria. Lubricants can do that. Spermicides can do that. There's just a number of different things that can impact the good bacteria in the vaginal microbiome. Now, the key thing to understand is that when you lose this good bacteria, when it comes to BV, it's not that something, a toilet bowl, a penis, a dildo, something got inserted in your vagina and introduced Gardnerella, which is the main species that's associated with BV, into your vagina. Gardnerella is a normal species that inhabits the vagina. Easiest explanation I can give you guys, and the easiest way to explain this is think of your gut. Everybody knows that your poop has E. coli. It does not matter how healthy your poop is. It does not matter how balanced your gut microbiome is. Your poop contains E. coli. That is normal. That is microbiology. So when it comes to the vagina, Gardnerella and anaerobes are normal to exist in the vagina. There's nothing wrong with having anaerobes in your vagina. So because anaerobes, like Gardnerella, naturally live in the vagina, when lactobacillus dies off, there's now nothing that's surveillancing the environment, or for a lack of a better word, stopping Gardnerella from invading and causing chaos and taking over. Gardnerella is not out here killing lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is just suppressing Gardnerella's activity. But when lactobacillus dies off, Gardnerella is like, oh my God, now's our chance because the military is weak. So now Gardnerella starts to take over. This shift is what we classify as bacterial vaginosis. BV is the deficiency of lactobacillus and the overgrowth of anaerobic bacteria. And it's not only Gardnerella, it can be other atopobium and some other Prevotella, like other anaerobes. Really, we have aerobic vaginitis, which is the overgrowth of aerobic bacteria. And in my opinion, I think BV, bacterial vaginosis, is a little misleading. I don't like personally the name of bacterial vaginosis because I feel like aerobic vaginitis, that's also bacteria. That's just aerobic bacteria. I think BV should be called anaerobic vaginitis because it's the overgrowth of anaerobic bacteria, and anaerobes are very normal to exist in the vagina and can easily take hold when lactobacillus decreases. And this is also true for aerobic vaginitis. When lactobacillus dies and there's a lactobacillus deficiency, aerobic bacteria can overgrow. So that's Enterococcus, that's E. coli. Those are aerobic pathogens and aerobic bacteria. They can naturally live in the vagina as well. Another one is group B strep. Group B strep is an aerobic bacterium. These bacteriums can overgrow when there's a deficiency of lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is the key, which is why I think BV is a bit misleading of a name, like calling it bacterial vaginosis. Aerobic vaginitis is bacterial. So I think that it should be called anaerobic vaginitis or vaginosis. The point is it's an overgrowth of anaerobic bacteria. And a lot of times you can see a co-infection of some other types of bacteria that aren't anaerobic that thrive in this environment. You see co-infections of mycoplasma or ureaplasma. Those can exist alongside BV, and so can aerobic vaginitis. It's almost like a hidden infection that goes undetected because most physicians and clinicians are not even thinking about aerobic vaginitis because anaerobic vaginitis, BV, is the main infection that takes hold when lactobacillus deficiency occurs. It's the most common one. The ecosystem thrives and shifts. We know that BV is most common, but that doesn't ignore the fact that other bacterium can take hold too and cause problems. When that happens, there's this deficiency of lactobacillus that allowed for this now infection to occur, and a lot of people go and take antibiotics, and the antibiotics deplete the overgrowth of the anaerobic bacteria, but now you still have a deficiency of lactobacillus. I think a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of times when you're taking antibiotics, you're never eradicating, especially something that's normal to exist in the body. You're not eradicating it completely. You're reducing the microbial load. And that's important to understand because something like chlamydia, for example, which is a true STI, does not belong in the vagina at all in any amount, whether it's this much or this much. Like, it does not belong inside of the vagina. Because of that, when you're taking azithromycin or doxycycline, whatever you get prescribed, if you are taking azithromycin for chlamydia, the goal is to eradicate it completely because it's a foreign invader. Antibiotics designed for foreign invaders will typically eradicate it altogether. But when we're talking about broad spectrum medications like metronidazole for BV that broadly targets anaerobes for the most part, it might not eradicate all of the Gardnerella. It'll just reduce the microbial load. And that distinction matters because if you bring Gardnerella down to a low amount and you still don't have lactobacillus, you still have this deficiency of lactobacillus, well, guess what? The Gardnerella's microbial load of being low still has the opportunity to thrive again because nothing's keeping it in check. Where this brings me around the conversation to, do men give women BV? I think what a lot of people don't understand is the missing piece of having a lactobacillus deficiency. Because if you have this lactobacillus deficiency, and again, a low microbial load after antibiotics of Gardnerella can thrive again. And for many people, they think, I got treated, and they're intimate with their partners again. And does bacteria pass between people? Yes, that's microbiology. If I kiss my boyfriend, we are sharing microbes that are in our oral microbiome with each other. That is normal. The difference, however, is even with like a female mouth and a male mouth, there's some differences anatomically and microbiologically between the two mouths. But generally speaking, a mouth is a mouth and it's the same. It's generally speaking, I know there's some differences, but generally speaking, the mouth is the same anatomy. When we're talking about the penis is an external structure. Is it similar? Yeah, there's similarities to the vulva and the clitoris and things like that. But the vaginal canal is a different anatomical and microbiological structure and environment than the penis. And so the penile microbiome is still being understood. We have to understand that like the vagina is a canal. That's not the outside, it's the inside. It's a canal, it's inside. The tissue is different than the outside of the penis. The moisture content is different than the penis, which is an external structure. The temperature inside is different. The environment is different than a penis. When we know that Gardnerella and anaerobic bacteria like Gardnerella are mainly habitants of the vaginal ecosystem, it's a bit absurd to then pretend that just because they are normal creatures of the vagina, that they can then live on the penis. That is an irresponsible statement to make, to say, oh, well, if it can live in the vagina, it can live on the penis. There is no research that concludes and can confidently say that penises hold Gardnerella and penises are the environment for Gardnerella. That is simply not a true statement. It's very irresponsible then to make a conclusion based on the study, and we'll talk about the study, to say that, oh, BV can be passed from a man to a woman when we know biological females, the vagina, anyone with like a vagina, are habitants of Gardnerella. Gardnerella is native to the vagina, not the penis. And listen, that's not to say that research can't evolve. And I could come back in a year and say, guess what? We found out the penis does carry Gardnerella and Gardnerella can be a host on a penis. Research is allowed to evolve. And as a biomedical engineer who studies female reproductive health, one of the things I've always prided myself to is being able to be open-minded to new and emerging science. Like that is at my core what I believe in, is being open to new science. Just because this is what exists today, it's not Bible. Like science evolves. We can learn more. And so with that being said, right now, what we do know is that Gardnerella is native to the vagina. That's the ecosystem that Gardnerella is native to. Microbiologically, bacteria can be passed between partners. If I spit on my hand right now and I go and shake another person's hand, they can have bacteria from my saliva or bacteria on my hand pass to them. If you go to the gas station, whoever touched the pump, like then the pump can be transferred to my hand and stuff like that. That's microbiology. If there's an overgrowth of Gardnerella and the female partner has no idea and is intimate with a male partner, yes, Gardnerella can be transferred to the penis, but there's no research research that shows us or tells us like, yes, the penis harbors Gardnerella for a long period of time, or that now Gardnerella is native to the penis. There's no evidence to suggest that. Usually Gardnerella on a penis will last obviously for a few hours post-sex, but if cleansed properly and the foreskin is lifted, Gardnerella does not continue thriving on the penile microbiome. That's an important understanding. Maybe the male penis does harbor it for a few days, even with properly cleansing, okay? Let's assume the male penis harbors it for 48 hours, right? And they're having sex again. Yes, they can be sharing microbes. Like that is something that happens in microbiology, but that does not mean that it is sexually transmitted. That's not how it works. It's not a sexually transmitted infection. A sexually transmitted infection would mean that this bacterium or this infection only comes from sex. That's why chlamydia, gonorrhea, HIV, they come from sexual contact with bodily fluids. That's why they are STIs. You don't get BV exclusively from sex. There's plenty of people who are celibate, plenty of people who are not intimate, plenty of people who aren't having sex who have BV. I've seen comments like on my Instagram when I've made like this type of discussion before and I've made a reel talking about this, but there's people who are like, oh, well, like there's no research that like virgins do have BV. And I think that that's just like an absurd thing to say, because generally speaking, I don't know how many people who are virgins would be open to a study where like the vaginal microbiome needs to be cultured, meaning a swab needs to go inside of the vaginal canal to test to see what the composition is. I just feel like it's a little like insane for people to be like, well, how can you say virgins do have BV if we've never swabbed their vagina? And I think there has been a few studies and they're not very rigorous and there's not that many. So I can't blanketly tell you, oh yeah, virgins are having BV, because there's not a whole lot of research on that. And the reason is because, I don't know, would a virgin individual feel comfortable, someone who's never had sex, feel comfortable with something going inside of their vagina? Potentially. And I know there has been research that showcases like testing or swabbing the vaginal microbiome of virgins or people who just never had penetrative sex with a male partner, or I think just sex in general with a male or female partner. There has been research around that, but I don't think it's rigorous. I don't think there's that much research. But my point is I just think it's irresponsible to call it an STI just because the study itself, what it found was when they treated women with antibiotics and didn't treat the male partner with antibiotics, when they resumed having intercourse, BV came back at a faster rate than when both the male and the female partner were treated with antibiotics. Honestly, what that tells me is it proves microbiology, right? If the man and the woman are having sex, right? And let's assume Gardnerella can harbor on the penis for, let's say, a week. He has Gardnerella on his penis because the vagina put that on the penis. So at the tip of the penis, at the foreskin and things like that, there's maybe a little bit of harboring of Gardnerella. I think what's important to understand is, yes, if the vagina has been put through antibiotics and now you do insert some Gardnerella back into the vagina from the penis, yes, the Gardnerella will thrive and cause another infection, cause another overgrowth. That can absolutely happen because that's microbiology. But what I'm interested in seeing to prove this theory, because then that's where the blanket statement of, so the solution is treat the woman and treat the man, where I'm saying what would have happened if you treated just the woman and you gave her antibiotics and then you administered probiotics, rebalanced the vaginal microbiome. Essentially what BV is a dysbiosis, an imbalance of the microbiome where there's a deficiency of lactobacillus. So if you treated the overgrowth and then corrected the environment and then allowed her to resume sex with the male partner, would BV have come back? My educated assumption is no. My guess is no. That's the point of rebalancing the ecosystem. Lactobacillus is what's resilient. Lactobacillus is what makes the vagina capable of being able to be strong. I don't want to ignore emerging research. Again, I'm not opposed to making statements of men and sex can have a role in BV. Sex is influential when it comes to the vaginal microbiome and BV. Like, we know that. I'm not denying that. I think like you have to think of it from a perspective of, okay, if your skin, the skin on your face is compromised and you're using antibacterial soaps, hypochlorous acid, benzoyl peroxide, a bunch of antimicrobials on your skin, on your face, and someone goes to touch your face, right? And they didn't wash their hands. They just go and touch your face and you're breaking out, right? But then you make the person wash their hands and touch your face, and you don't break out when they wash their hands and they disinfect their hands. They make sure their hands are clean, then touch your face, and you don't break out. That to me doesn't signal that the hands of that individual are what's contaminating your skin. What that tells me is that your skin is not resilient. It tells me that your skin is not capable of fighting back or even being able to clear and function properly. The vagina has been coined as a self-cleaning organ for a reason. Sex shouldn't immediately trigger a BV infection. If it does and it reoccurs, that tells me that your vagina is not resilient. It's not functioning as a self-cleaning ecosystem like it should, because the ecosystem was never restored. And I think that that is so important to understand. It's the same thing where like your gut, you shouldn't necessarily, like, we're talking gut dysbiosis, right? A lot of people, when they get like H. pylori or they'll have like C. diff, when they have like gut overgrowths and then they take antibiotics, one of the most common sentiments I hear is that after I had C. diff and I took the antibiotics to clear it, I literally was sensitive to every type of food that you can think of. That to me signals that your gut environment, your gut microbiome is not resilient. Your gut microbiome should be able to tolerate different dressings on a salad. Obviously, we're getting into, please, like, don't misconstrue what I'm saying where it's like, oh, what if someone has gastritis? What if someone has IBS? I understand there's different conditions. That's not what I'm talking about. Where I'm talking in the context of the microbiome, and we're talking about C. diff. A lot of people have C. diff, take antibiotics, and the antibiotics kill the C. diff, but also can impact the overall gut microbiome, which makes a lot of people more sensitive to all different types of food. And when that happens, people just feel like, oh, my life has been altered forever. I can't eat certain things. And so many women will share the same sentiment of, I had one BV infection and now I feel like sex is always a trigger for me. I feel like I can't have sex or play around with different lubes or play around with different things that I do during sex because boom, I get BV right after. To me, that's not signaling that the man gave BV to the woman. To me, that's signaling that your vagina is not resilient. Again, the vagina has been coined as a self-cleaning ecosystem for a reason, because when the vaginal microbiome is balanced, the vaginal microbiome is capable of saying like, oh, look, there's a little bit of Gardnerella from that skin. Clear. We're good, because lactobacillus is functioning as a military. Obviously, and this is true, like there's a lot of research that highlights that having a balanced vaginal microbiome that's dominated by lactobacillus has put people at a lower risk of STIs. It's not saying that that's foolproof, right? So just because you have lactobacillus dominance doesn't mean that you'll never get chlamydia, but the chances of you contracting chlamydia are lower than somebody who has BV or who has a deficiency of lactobacillus. And that is something that's really important to talk about, because that in itself further proves this hypothesis of mine that it all comes back to making the vagina resilient. And how you do that is by reestablishing the good bacteria through probiotic supplementation. So it just kills me when people ignore that fact and just focus on kill bacteria, use antibiotics, and do not consider the ecosystem at large and zoom out and recognize, but what about the good bacteria? Because the reason somebody's having BV in the first place is because they have a deficiency of lactobacillus. The reason people have increased risks of contracting STIs like chlamydia, gonorrhea, HIV, HPV is because there's a deficiency of lactobacillus. Like, a deficiency of lactobacillus is linked to so many health risks that are relevant to bacteria, to microbiology, which further proves that having lactobacillus dominance is very, very, very important. So to do a study that focuses entirely on antibiotics without rebalancing the vaginal microbiome doesn't really make sense to me, because I feel like that's just a hole in the study. And I also want to acknowledge that one of the things that I thought was so crazy that wasn't done was the penile microbiome was never cultured or swabbed or tested for. There was confirmation that the female partner had BV, had Gardnerella or BV associated microbes in her vagina and got treated. The male partner was never swabbed or confirmed to be a carrier of anaerobic bacteria. That to me is a hole. Like, how can you say Gardnerella came from the penis or BV came from the penis without confirming that the penis was carrying these microbes to begin with? I get it, because when I brought this up before, a lot of people were like, so then where did the bacteria come from for the group where only the female partner was treated? And yes, maybe it did come from the penis, but I just feel like to strengthen a scientific paper and a scientific study, would you not want to confirm that the penis is a carrier? Would you not want to confirm that the Gardnerella was on the penis to make such a huge claim of BV's now classified as an STI? Like, that's crazy. That is such a crazy statement to make. And I'm also curious to know, these female partners who were swabbed and confirmed to have BV, was the BV confirmed in the sense of the entire vaginal microbiome was assessed, or was Gardnerella just found in these people just through like a PCR swab? Because a healthy and balanced vaginal microbiome can still show up positive for Gardnerella. And I've talked about this in the past, but I think it's very relevant. I've done like vaginal microbiome testing kits where it examines the entire vaginal microbiome. My microbiome is heavily dominated by lactobacillus, but there's still small amounts of Gardnerella and other like anaerobes that naturally live in the vagina, but it'll be like 98% lactobacillus and then like 2% of anaerobes. The thing that's baffling is when I've been to the gynecologist, if they've swabbed me, they're like, oh, there's Gardnerella. Yeah, that's normal for Gardnerella to exist. However, just because Gardnerella exists in the vagina doesn't mean anything if you're not comparing that relative to the entire environment. What does the entire vaginal microbiome look like? Does the entire vaginal microbiome show that there's Gardnerella overgrowth, or does the vaginal microbiome show, oh, there's some Gardnerella, but there's mainly lactobacillus? Because that makes a difference. If you're doing a standard PCR test and you're testing positive for Gardnerella, that doesn't mean that you have BV if the entire microbiome is not assessed. So I think that there's a gap in how we're even diagnosing women with BV, because I was then told like, oh, you should take metronidazole antibiotics. And I was like, no, because I don't have BV. Just because the swab showed there's Gardnerella does not mean that I have BV, because when you test my entire microbiome and examine the microbiome as a whole, the microbiome test shows that my microbiome was balanced, that I had a dominating presence of lactobacillus. I did not have BV. So then if I would have taken antibiotics unnecessarily, that could have caused more harm than good for my body and for my vagina and the vaginal microbiome. I'm curious to know, what was the technique in which, like, was the entire microbiome assessed, which I don't think it was. The penile microbiome was not examined or cultured or swabbed to confirm that they're carriers. And there is no discussion that highlights the importance of reestablishing good bacteria in the vagina. So I just think essentially there was like a big gap in how this was examined. And I just think it's so harmful to blanketly say this, especially because too, there's so many people who get BV who aren't intimate with men. People with vaginas, regardless of their gender identity or their sexual identity, just people with vaginas having sex with other people with vaginas, whether that's through sharing toys, whether that's through vagina to vagina contact, whether that's with fingers. There are people who are intimate with other people with vaginas who still get BV. So what does that mean? If we're saying like men are the cause of BV, you are literally like isolating an entire group of people who are having sex who don't understand how they're getting BV. And if anything, it would make sense that two vaginas with compatible environments can shift each other's environment more than a penis could impact the vagina. I said it. I think that two vaginas can alter each other more than a penis can alter the vagina, because I'm so sick and tired of female reproductive health being looked at through a heterosexual lens where every single type of infection is reduced down to a man giving it to a woman. I think we need to decenter men in the conversation of vaginal infections, because not all vaginal infections just come from a man. I don't think that that is smart to say. I don't think that that is helpful to say, because realistically, two people with a vagina have compatible environments. They're compatible environments. And if anything, research shows us people who are in same-sex relationships can influence, in regards to female sex relationships, they can influence each other's vaginal microbiomes. So if a partner has a very healthy vaginal microbiome that's dominated by lactobacillus, that partner can influence the other partner's vaginal microbiome pretty easily because they're compatible environments. And the opposite is also true. If someone's having dysbiosis and the overgrowth of Gardnerella, that can negatively influence the other partner's vaginal microbiome. They do adapt to one another because the environments are compatible. It's the same anatomy. It's a vagina, the vaginal canal, so they can influence one another. So I think it's so crazy to me that we're so caught up in making blanket statements that the penis is responsible for these infections while ignoring other research that talks about same-sex relationships in regards to female reproductive health and female anatomy and how vaginas can actually pass bacteriums from one another. But we're so quick to just say, yeah, men give people BV at alarming rates. Are we studying same-sex relationships to make such a blanket heterosexual statement? The answer is no. So I think it's very crazy. And I think that that's just something that's really important to understand. I'm not saying that the penis has zero impact. I know that the penis has an impact and a role. That is 100% true. However, I don't think BV is an STI. I know that BV at this stage is not an STI. I'm open to more research that can say otherwise, but at this stage, it's irresponsible to say BV is an STI. It's irresponsible to reclassify it as an STI. And I also think the way that we're testing for BV is not up to date with science. I think that overprescribing antibiotics is absolutely contributing to vaginal dysbiosis and BV cases. And I think the lack of acknowledgement of probiotics in healthcare is causing more harm than good for female reproductive health wellness. I think the fact that probiotics are not widely recognized yet is something that is a flaw in medicine, because I think that some people just want to reject nutraceuticals. And I understand, because I cannot say it loud enough that I am a scientist first. I am not a fan of many things in the health and wellness space. I am not a anti-science person whatsoever. I mean, I am at my core science first. I believe in science. Science is how we learn about natural things. We learn about natural ingredients, probiotics, amino acids, different vitamins. We learn about how they work because of science and through science. So science is literally the core, the foundation of natural things. But for whatever reason, I just think in general, a lot of scientific professionals will just ignore those things and ignore the science around those things and reject it entirely, which I think is harmful. And I would love to see how standardizing care for BV would include full vaginal microbiome testing, appropriate antibiotic prescription, and then probiotic restoration. I think with those three things implemented, we would see a reduction in recurrence, a reduction in actual reported cases of BV, because again, I think there's so many reported cases of bacterial vaginosis because I think people are being inaccurately or falsely positive for BV, like myself, when I didn't actually have BV, but the PCR test is saying, yes, you do, because you have Gardnerella in your vagina, but presence alone means nothing if the entire vaginal microbiome is not assessed. So I think that all of that is just super important. So I think we would see less BV cases if the vaginal microbiome was completely assessed, or maybe we would see more BV cases. In fact, up to 70% of people can be asymptomatic asymptomatic with BV. So they might not be getting tested at their gyno because they don't even think that they have BV. And then if microbiome testing kits were done regularly for annual gynecological appointments, it's very possible that it would pick up on asymptomatic BV, somebody who's having dysbiosis that had no idea that they had dysbiosis because they weren't having any symptoms. I think it could go either way, but regardless, I think it's more accurate testing. I think we're confirming and actually recognizing who has BV and who doesn't. So who actually has BV is an important topic of discussion, an important thing to identify so that we are accurately prescribing antibiotics. We're accurately treating those individuals and we are preventing long-term health complications, because people who have dysbiosis and don't even know it can have this bacterium spread to the upper reproductive tract and cause pelvic inflammatory disease or infertility, endometriitis, and other things. So I think it's really important for us to accurately diagnose people, accurately treat people, and then accurately restore the vaginal microbiome. And together, that three-tiered approach, I think, would result in less BV reoccurrence. So that's just my opinion as a biomedical engineer who studies female reproductive health. I'm always open to, again, new and emerging science, but that's kind of what I think at this stage. And that's my thoughts on BV. And I think this video is getting really, really long and my laptop's about to die and I don't want it to die in the middle of filming this. Yeah, if you guys have any other questions about BV and want me to talk about BV a little more and you have a part 2 or you want me to do a Q&A or something of that nature, let me know and I can do that. But that's going to be it for this episode. I hope you guys liked it. It was just very casual. Let's sit down. Let's chat about BV. Let me share my thoughts as a BME. So I hope that it was helpful and I hope you guys really enjoyed it. And I love you guys so much. And I will see you in the next episode. Bye, guys.